If you had said to me we would use the words Swiss lawyer and superstar in the same sentence, I wouldn't have believed it, except that we now do have somebody who is really the superstar in uncovering and documenting and meticulously reporting and recording the horrors that are being inflicted upon Julian Assange by our states. It is my pleasure to welcome UN Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Detention and Torture, Nils Melzer.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. 200 years ago, in this continent, and this island belongs to this continent, even today, despite all kinds of exits. 200 years ago, we decided we no longer want absolute governmental power. We no longer want rulers that can do with us whatever they want. We want state and government to be subject to the rule of law. And we got rid of those absolutist rulers, and we created democracies and the separation of power. So now governmental power is divided in a judiciary, a legislative power, and a government, and they're supposed to control each other, to balance each other, the so-called system of checks and balances. And all of this is based on democratic legitimacy. That's the system, that's the theory. Now we have a small problem, the human factor. Humans are not by nature democratic. And you can see it in traffic. The lower the probability of sanctions, the higher the probability of slight oversteppings of lines and violations. My point is, uncontrolled power will be abused. That's why we created this 200 years ago. And based on a very painful experience of centuries and centuries of absolutist rule. I am claiming that today we are at the critical point where we might fall back behind that line again, unwittingly. This type of system is prone to collusion, yeah? The courts, they talk with the ministers, and the minister talk to the members of parliament, and it's party politics, and then they have the lobbies, and so it's all a big club, the so-called establishment. So to control that, we have the press. Yeah? Don't worry, I'm not going to lecture too long. I'm just going to say that's what this is about. We need a free press that actually holds government to account and makes sure that they're actually checking and balancing and they're not colluding and abusing the power. If the mainstream media no longer does that, it is logical that we will have other actors coming up and trying to inform the people, not just to entertain them, but to empower them so they can actually exercise their democratic control. So here stops my professor part with the lecture, but this is what this is about. This is the context, and this is what we're risking to lose when we're starting to imprison people who tell us the truth that is no longer told to us by the governments, that are no longer told to us by the press. I started investigating this case last April, and I expected this to be very short. I was quite reluctant to get into it. I was poisoned by the same narrative as everybody else. Assange, the rapist, the narcissist, the hacker, the spy. I thought I needed to go to prison, visit him with 2 medical doctors, independent experts, to be sure we have an objective assessment. And I wasn't expecting to find anything dramatic and to return back to the office and basically go on to deal with real torture. What I found was very different. I found a man who had been hunted for a decade. I found documents that illustrated a profound corruption in the judicial system that the judicial system had actually been abused to persecute a man, to push him into a corner, and to intimidate everybody else in the world who could perhaps have the dangerous idea of copying the methods of WikiLeaks and actually inform the public about government and what they are doing with the tax money that is paid to them and the power that is delegated to them. And the deeper I got into this case, the more profoundly I was shocked at how Western democracies have lost their course. I'm not saying we don't have rule of law in Britain and in Sweden and in the US and all the other Western countries in cases that don't threaten establishment power. But as soon as that power is threatened, we do not have the rule of law. I investigated this case, and sometimes I'm being told, well, you're overstepping the line. This has nothing to do with torture. I'm asking, how does it not have anything to do with torture when a man exposes evidence for war crimes and torture and rape, and no one is being prosecuted for that? How is that not a violation of the prohibition of torture? How is it not a violation of the prohibition of torture when someone is being hunted for years and exposed to intense, deliberate defamation, mobbing, and judicial persecution in order to intimidate the world of investigative journalism? Because intimidation, not interrogation, is the primary purpose of torture throughout the world. Torturers know very well that when they torture people, they might not get the truth. But they know where torture works always is when you want to intimidate people. Not only the victim, but everybody else. That's why women get raped on the village square, because everybody needs to be intimidated. That's the purpose of torture. That's the true face of torture. And that's what torture is about here, too. It's someone being publicly destroyed in front of our eyes, systematically and painfully. You can watch it in slow motion. To pass the message, if ever you dare to publish information that we declared secret, this is what's going to happen to you, and no one, not the special rapporteur, no one else can protect you. And this is where we have to say stop. I have been mandated by states to report to states about their compliance with the prohibition of torture. I found in this case a violation. I reported it. I stuck to my procedures, but the states didn't do their job. They did not investigate. They refused to investigate. They refused even to engage in a dialogue with me, even to respond to the questions I am mandated by them to ask. But they say, I lost my impartiality. Am I supposed to be impartial between a torturer and a tortured? No. I'm supposed to be neutral and objective in investigating a case and not to have any presumption before I have actually investigated the case. But once I have found that someone has been tortured, of course I am not neutral, but I will defend the victim of torture. This case involves torture because Julian Assange has exposed torture, and it has not been prosecuted. And we're talking about war crimes, but he's being threatened with 175 years in prison. How grotesque is that? A man who has never killed anybody, who has never used violence on anybody. And in the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, the highest fixed term sentence was 45 years. 175 years, plus 10 years of persecution. That's the first aspect. Then his own abuse is the second aspect of torture, and obviously what expects him there in the United States, we know it. And it's not just me, it's my predecessors, it's a host of human rights organizations, even human rights organizations like Amnesty International that refuse to recognize that Julian Assange is a prisoner of conscience. Even they recognize that the prison conditions there are inherently inhumane and that therefore his extradition would be unlawful. So that's a clear bar to his extradition. What shocked me so profoundly, I expected when I write to Sweden or to Britain, I will get a response. The response I got, the Foreign Office says, the UK does not participate in or solicit or condone torture. However, when the UK Parliament reports in 2018, the Intelligence Security Committee, that the UK has been involved much more systematically in CIA torture than was thought beforehand, and asked for a judicial inquiry, which they're obliged to do under the Convention Against Torture. You need to investigate and prosecute. The government refuses to do so. So it's not just about the case of Julian Assange. There seems to be a general policy of not investigating torture and ill treatment that has been conducted and perpetrated on the orders of the government. They wrote in a letter to me in 2018, I quote, "We take allegations of torture very seriously and investigate allegations against UK personnel," end of quote. But the UK government flatly refuses to even discuss torture findings that two independent medical doctors who are world-renowned, who have no interest in losing their credibility, their diagnosis, they don't want to discuss it with me, they don't want to investigate, they don't even want to respond to me. The Foreign Office claims, I quote, "Journalism is not a crime," and they have a high-profile campaign for press freedom, yet they detain a journalist, Europe's most prominent political prisoner, just a few miles from that conference, and his name is not even mentioned in that conference at all. And then the UK says in a letter to me, in response to my press statement after my visit to Julian Assange, they say to the press, the UK has a close working relationship with UN bodies and supports the important work of the Special Rapporteur on Torture, end of quote. Yet, I'm still waiting for their response. More than 100 days after I sent an urgent appeal to the UK government because I was afraid for Julian Assange's life, 100 days later, I'm still waiting for them to even respond to my letter. How is that a close working relationship? Perhaps I should send them my address because they went to see the High Commissioner of Human Rights to complain about me, thinking that she's my boss. She isn't. I'm independent. I'm appointed directly by the Human Rights Council. But the ambassador in Geneva seems to have told her that he's not happy with the way I conduct my mandate in this case. Incidentally, I heard they also told my employer in Glasgow they were not too happy about how I conduct my mandate. Now, I refuse to be intimidated. I conduct the mandate that the United Nations has given to me according to the best of my knowledge and my judgment. It is a violation of my independence to try to circumvent official procedures and to try to undermine my credibility and standing with the United Nations and my employer. And I will certainly not back down. I'm not fighting against the UK government, and certainly not against the UK people, but I'm fighting for the UK people and the prohibition of torture that they and their country stand for. When the Foreign Office of the UK writes to me, the UK is committed to the rule of law, but no branch of government seems to see any problem with Assange's most basic right being violated, namely his right even to prepare his defense. then where's the credibility? Then I say to the Foreign Office, as I've said before, it is high time to quit talking the talk and to start walking the walk. It is also high time for the UK people to take the democratic means at their disposal and to hold their government to account and to use their institutions to do so. We thought it was a good idea to organize tomorrow an event at Chatham House, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The event was booked and paid for, I'm told. But suddenly, it was cancelled by Chatham House. And I thought, isn't that striking? In the year 2020, which marks the 100th anniversary, where the Chatham House on its website speaks of 100 years of independent thinking, they're afraid, and they now have, not the Swedish already have got cold feet, but now they have cold feet as well. And luckily, Frontline Club has picked up the slack of independent thinking and will have their event there tomorrow. So the Foreign Office, Chatham House, BBC. It's more than 9 months I'm trying to have an interview with BBC and to see how they disagree with my assessment. I propose to have a hard-talk interview with them. They feel it's not newsworthy. As we have seen a recent interview with Joe Correa by BBC, they still adhere to the version and to the narrative that Julian Assange evaded justice. Some of you who follow me on Twitter may have seen how I reacted to that in 1940, Hannah Arendt was arrested by the Gestapo for anti-state propaganda. She was interned by the Vichy regime and then succeeded to escape to the US, where she got asylum. Did she evade justice? Did Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, in 1956, when the Soviets invaded Hungary and he escaped to the US embassy, where he spent 15 years in hiding until his safe passage could finally be guaranteed, did he evade justice? Did Fang Lizhi, in 1989, who was at the top of China's wanted list for inciting the Tiananmen protests, he sought asylum in the US embassy in Beijing. Did he evade justice? From the perspective of China, he did. I mentioned Moses Kushaba Rovreko from Uganda, who sought and received asylum in the US in 2009 when his native Uganda debated passing a bill allowing the death penalty or life imprisonment for homosexuality. Did he evade justice? Or even Najibullah. Not everybody may agree with him. He cooperated with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. He was the last president. When the Mujahideen took over in '92, he sought refuge in the UN headquarters in Kabul, where he stayed until 1996, when the Taliban pulled him out, tortured him, and hung him from a lamppost in the streets for everybody to see. Do you think his hiding was evading justice? So what's the difference to Julian Assange, who's seeking asylum in Ecuador, from a judiciary that has proven for a decade that it's not pursuing the law, but it is pursuing the freedom of press? How is that different? Where we know that if he gets extradited to the US, he will be convicted for espionage, and he will be sentenced to life in prison in inhumane conditions. Is this evading justice? How far have we sunk? if we prosecute people that expose war crimes for exposing war crimes, how far have we sunk when we no longer prosecute our own war criminals because we identify more with them than we identify with the people that actually expose these crimes? What does that tell about us and about our governments? How far have we sunk when we prosecute whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and first sentence them to 35 years in prison? Again, compare it to the war criminals in The Hague that are sentenced to 40 years for genocide. How far have we sunk when telling the truth becomes a crime? It's urgent. I'm glad to see you here, but what hurts me are the empty seats. It's really urgent. We need to strengthen our voice, and we have to wake people up. Thank you.